In accordance with its constitution, the United States of America has an obligation to protect its own sovereignty, as well as safeguarding the security of all its inhabitants. These noble terms of civility and honor come into question on February 19th, 1942. Just after a fleet of kamikaze pilots decimated Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 saw the relocation and internment of over 120,000 law-abiding Japanese Americans. First and second generation Japanese Americans were imprisoned without the sanctity of due process of law, all in the name of preserving national security. Fueled in wartime hysteria and racial prejudice, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, justified by Executive Order 9066, was a monumental failure of the US government to uphold its constitutional responsibilities. This not only violated the civil rights of thousands of citizens, but also failed to provide any measurable security benefits, exposing a severe lapse in governmental judgment and accountability. In pursuit of cheap labor, America had welcomed its first generation of Japanese immigrants in 1885. The growing, flourishing economic prosperity of Japanese Americans was met with rising racial tensions. By the early 20th century, under the claim that Japanese civilians were an unassimilable race, legislatures pushed the agenda of a societal segregation of these civilians. As seen with the 1906 San Francisco exclusionary laws to racially segregate schools, Japanese Americans were marked as alien, a threat to the American way of life. Progressive moves were made to counter this, as seen with Theodore Roosevelt's Gentleman's Agreement, for which promised no discrimination would befall upon Japanese Americans, in exchange for cutting off immigration from Japan, with the exception of wives of those who already established themselves in America. However, that never halted the pursuit of lawmakers in providing legislation that ordained Japanese American discrimination. Washington, Oregon, and California continued to provide anti-alien laws, and in 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that anyone of Japanese origin could not be considered proper citizens of America, as they were neither white nor black. And the Gentleman's Agreement was completely disbanded by 1924, as Japanese immigration altogether was completely banned. And as racial discrimination continued to escalate, the fears on whether or not Japanese loyalty to America was legitimate had seemingly been given an answer.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 9066. It authorized the creation of military zones to provide and house the relocation of anyone by which the US government sees necessary in order to preserve national sovereignty. These zones encompass the entirety of the American West Coast. Roosevelt himself was informed by reports from the State Department and FBI that there wasn't in fact a problem with the Japanese on the West Coast. However, the public was quickly convinced through wartime propaganda that the main enemy were those hailing across the Pacific Theater from the land of the rising sun. Thus, it concerned very few in the American majority when 120,000 Japanese Americans were excluded and quickly forced to relocate, most only being notified through news advertisements and flyers stuck to telephone poles just a few days prior. The consequential arduous task of having to sell property and belongings proved to be a massive hit on many citizens, as they packed only what they could carry, not sure where their odyssey would take them and how long it would be. 70% of these people were indeed American citizens.
And so we were just gazing out the front window, and suddenly we saw two soldiers marching up our driveway, and they stomped at the front porch and with their fists began pounding on the door. My father came out, answered the door, and we were ordered out of our home. We were leaving our home, and under, to us, sudden and unhappy circumstances, soldiers ordering us about.
Evacuees were transported to temporary assembly centers at many public facilities, including fairgrounds and racetracks, many of whom were lucky to even own a mattress to sleep on. Eventually, evacuees were then moved to more permanent housings known as relocation centers, found in the interior of the United States, in the midst of barren wastelands. And the conditions could not have been any worse.
They were America's versions of concentration camps.
We went to sent to Santa Anita. We were put in stables.
Obviously looking forward to a grand evening until we turned the bend and we looked down the valley and we saw a large formation of barracks lined up like military barracks, and we assumed it was a military base. Well, this one had barbed wires all around with machine gun towers on the corners.
The conditions internees faced in these camps were so severe and destructive, the whole operation failed to meet U.S. Army standards. Frederick Korematsu's legal battle epitomizes the tragic injustice of this time. Korematsu was arrested for violating military civilian exclusion order for not wanting to give up his freedom, as he stayed in prohibited areas after receiving instructions that he was to be excluded from said areas and had to report directly to an assembly center. The 1944 Korematsu v. United States Supreme Court ruling upheld his conviction, dismissing his due process and equal protection claims under the 5th and 14th Amendments. The court deferred to wartime authority, allowing racial discrimination to be justified under the guise of national security. The Korematsu decision was clear in how the government had no strong evidence suggesting that Japanese Americans posed a threat. Fear and prejudice drove the decision, leaving thousands of citizens invulnerable. The emotional toll of internment was further exacerbated by the government's demand for loyalty. Internees were forced to prove their allegiance to the United States through loyalty questionnaires, a process that only deepened their marginalization. Seida Moriyama's poem, Loyalty, in May 1943, published in the Tulin Dispatch, a newspaper produced directly in the camps, encapsulates the emotional struggle faced by Japanese Americans during this time. The poem critiques the loyalty questionnaire as a manipulative tool used to further alienate a population already unjustly imprisoned. Her words reflect the internal conflict of individuals who, despite their innocence, were compelled to demonstrate loyalty to a government that had already violated their rights. Horrible conditions and inhumane treatment continued to pervade over the next 2 years. Yet a glimmer of justice was provided in the case of Mitsuo Endo. Endo, a law-abiding Japanese American who had complied with the government's orders, was unjustly denied release despite her loyalty to the United States. Her legal team filed for a writ of habeas corpus, leading to the ex parte Endo ruling in 1944. The Supreme Court decided that loyal citizens couldn't be detained without due process, offering some relief but underscoring the broader injustice. The government couldn't imprison citizens based solely on racial suspicion. Ex parte Endo proved successful in this regard and was monumental in the internment camps finally being shut down in January 1945. Yet the odyssey of these internees would only continue, as they were released with little compensation, just a train ticket and $25. No reparations, no apologies, nothing at all, and the scars of displacement and loss ran deep. Unbeknownst to them, people who weren't able to foreclose property in time or were removed without notice often found middle-class white owners now in possession of their initial land and belongings. Internment survivors face ongoing racial tensions, with many struggling to rebuild their lives, homes, and businesses. The Japanese internment in the United States exemplifies the dangers of fear-driven security policies. Civilians suffered for decades until Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, granting $20,000 in reparations and a formal apology from President Reagan 30 years later. Aside from letters from Presidents Bush and Clinton, the government has done little to atone, reinforcing the notion that civil rights were justly sacrificed for national security. Yet the scars of internment remain, a lasting reminder of the government's cowardly negligence, and will endure for generations.